just like corn. Yeah, I can see that. Makes sense.
Yeah, I hope.
That's subsidies. Well, because they are. Oh, well.
I just feel like, I mean, I wasn't volunteering.
Yeah, I think.
And I feel like,
Yeah.
that was the issue.
Oh, that's annoying. I mean, we publish it now? Yes. Oh, annoying. That secretary will take too much time.
I have this right here.
Oh, yeah,
Top
I
of your
would
head
know
is
it.
kind of in it.
Are you able to, I mean, which way can I go?
This way.
Put down your extra pen in my mouth. All right, try everything.
A little bit better?
A little bit more, please.
So many pens. Yeah, I'm just gonna shoot here, so
Yeah.
you're okay in front of me though.
I mean, I'm my head's in the
At some points I'm going to go there. Oh well. 13? Well, at this guy's sunglasses. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
DC weather. I have a number of people that you're going to hear from this afternoon about the States Reform Act. We have folks from South Carolina, Jill Swing from South Carolina's Compassionate Care. We have veterans that you're going to hear from this afternoon. We have folks from law enforcement that you're going to hear about, and industry about this bill. I'm very excited. I've been working on this piece of legislation for the better part of the year, for about 9 months. I've been working on this. When I was a state lawmaker in South Carolina, I worked on medical cannabis reform in the state of South Carolina. And then today, as a member of Congress, I have an opportunity to continue that work with the States Reform Act. This particular piece of legislation, when I look at what's going on across the country for the better part of 25 years, since 1995, when the state of California was looking at medical use for cannabis, there are only 3 states today across the entire country that have no cannabis reform regulations or laws whatsoever. So my home state of South Carolina, for example, we allow CBD. Just south of South Carolina and Florida, they have medical marijuana. And then you can go to other states across the country like California that have adult use cannabis. And so when we're looking at cannabis reform at the federal level, we have to understand and take into account all of the different provisions, reforms, regulations, and laws that are already existing across different states across the country. And I would categorize this bill as what some have reported as a compromise bill. There are pieces of this legislation that bring forth ideas that previous Republican bills that have been filed. It also takes into account some of the reforms that Democrats have filed in previous legislation related to cannabis. And this legislation, I believe, has something good for everyone, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican. And so, first off, allow cannabis to be researched. We know that there are medical benefits to it, so descheduling will do that. It protects each state's unique laws and reforms. It takes into account the federal level that every state is different. My state of South Carolina, we have CBD. Florida has medical marijuana. California has adult use cannabis. And so what we're going to do at the federal level would tax it and regulate it, recognizing all of that. And to do that, the agencies that we would utilize at the federal level, if you're a grower, it would be regulated under USDA. If it's a product, it would be under ATF. If it's with interstate commerce, which is included in this bill, it'd be under TTP, for example. If it's going to be regulated as medical, it would be done under the FDA agencies. And so we took special care to understand and recognize that we would need different agencies. It would be regulated like alcohol in that regard. This legislation will also protect veterans. There are special provisions in there that ensure that veterans are not discriminated against for using cannabis. It ensures that veterans, when they're going for their VA benefits, that they don't lose their VA benefits. If they're a vet, they would be allowed, the VA would be allowed to describe and prescribe cannabis based on its benefits for that veteran. So there's special protections in there. This bill would also support businesses, in particular these small businesses. That's very important to this piece of legislation. There are certain protections. And so if this bill were to be passed today, this is turnkey legislation, but we have the Safe Banking Act that was passed out of the House in April. It's also included in the NDAA. But if we were to pass this bill today, there wouldn't be a need for safe banking because businesses would operate and be legal and regulated just like alcohol. So that would not be an issue. There's also special funding for small businesses within the 3% excise tax where that funding would go. And that leads me to the 3% federal excise tax. I kept it very low. One of the biggest differences that you'll see in the States Reform Act is regards to the taxation. Now, if you look at states, you're going to see like California, where taxes are very high on cannabis, there's still an illicit market. So when we go to do the excise tax, and it would apply to CBD, hemp, all cannabis products, the funding for that excise tax, we want to make sure that it's very low. It's got to be under 4% in order to reduce the opportunity for illicit markets or black markets in different states, depending on how they're legalized. Now, within the 3% federal excise tax, Section 502 of the bill relates to the excise tax. Section 501 has to do with where that funding would go, and there's some room in there to negotiate where those things would go. But, for example, part of the excise tax funding would go to small businesses and supporting them. Part of it would go to law enforcement and second chances, retraining some of our law enforcement. It would go to states that have opioid crises that they're facing across the country. There is some funding that would go to veterans and mental health. There's funding from the excise tax that would also go to educating kids who are under the age of 21 on cannabis, ensuring that they aren't using it. And then one of the other elements to this bill is safe criminal justice reform. So at the federal level, this legislation would expunge records for strictly cannabis use. It would allow those that we're serving today that are strictly cannabis in federal prison for that they would be released. Now that does not include, there's an exception for those who are convicted of a DUI and an exception for those who might be trafficking or a member of a cartel gang, etc. That is an exception within this. And then the last one, the big thing too, is this would be regulated a lot like alcohol. Whether we're talking about the actual farming of cannabis at that level, regulating product like that, etc., would be done very similarly or identical to alcohol. Another big difference between this piece of legislation and what's been filed previously by both Republicans and Democrats. So in about an hour, we're going to officially file the bill. We'll have 5 Republican original co-sponsors. We are getting a lot of great feedback from Republicans and Democrats on this bill. My main goal is to get as much Republican support as I can initially, and we're hearing great feedback from both chambers, from both sides of the aisle on this piece of legislation because it is a a go-between, a turnkey piece of legislation that is a compromise between what has been filed previously on both sides of the aisle. And I'm very proud of this work. We have a lot of people that have contributed and made this bill better. And there is, there's so much in here for everyone, whether you are a Republican or whether you are a Democrat. There's something in this bill for each of you, and I think most Americans to like. And this is a 70-30 issue across not only my district, but across the country. So with that, we're going to give a minute to a few people ahead. The first person I want to introduce is Jeremiah Mosteller, who's a senior policy analyst for AFP, or Americans for Prosperity.
Thank you, Representative Mace. As she said, my name is Jeremiah Mosteller, and I serve as a senior policy analyst at Americans for Prosperity. At AFP, we seek to empower millions of activists across the country to deal with some of the most critical issues we are facing in our local communities. While we are doing that, we support bottom-up solutions that emphasize freedom, individual responsibility, and the unique potential of every individual. We are here today to support the States Reform Act because it does just that. It embodies those principles. And we know that states in recent years have really taken an experimental approach and leaned into their role as the laboratories of democracy by implementing new types of cannabis policy. And we believe that it is time for the federal government to get out of the way. Our failed one-size-fits-all approach to cannabis is not working. And so we need states to be able to do what is best for their citizens. Arbitrary and unenforcement of federal law is not a permanent solution, and we need a permanent solution to this policy issue. And this could not come at a more opportune time. Cities across the country are facing unexpected increases in violent crime. Rather than our country continuing to spend trillions of dollars to enforce marijuana prohibition, we can better spend that money to implement targeted interventions that prevent and solve violent crime. So we really believe the State Reform Act is important because it will reorient the priorities of federal agencies to help assist state and local law enforcement to focus on their core mission, solving and preventing serious crime. We look forward to working with Representative Mace, the other co-sponsors of this bill, members of both parties, to truly restore state autonomy in this area. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Next we have Doug DeStasso, a Veterans Cannabis Project.
Thank you, Congresswoman Mace, for your leadership on this issue. My name is Doug DeStasso, the Executive Director of the Veterans Cannabis Project. We look for three things going forward. The first of which is the authorization of access for veterans. You know, it takes a lot of bravery to say you want to use this plant. It takes a lot of bravery to get out of the mess you're in a lot of times. And if we don't authorize that access explicitly, people just aren't going to come forward. So that's the first part, and this bill meets that. The second is to provide protections. There's many veterans living around you that are struggling because they don't have protection if they choose to use this plant. I could give you a million examples, but there's many of them probably standing right around here who work for the government who could probably use this to get them off another drug that's killing them or driving them down a hole. And they're just afraid, so we need to provide protections. The last thing is we need to require research. We need to know how this is helping people. We need to know why it's working on veterans, and we're ready to do that. We're ready to report the veterans are ready for that next step. So thank you for your leadership, and we hope others around here on the Hill provide the same level of leadership for those who provided leadership for this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. Next we have Gary Hess with Veterans Alliance for Holistic Alternatives.
Thank you, ma'am, for the opportunity, and I really appreciate the leadership of you stepping forward to take this issue and provide access to those in need. My name is Gary Hess I'm the Executive Director for the Veterans Alliance for Holistic Alternatives. In the last 20 years since the inception of conflict in 2001, we have lost approximately 7,000 service members in that conflict and combat operations. In that same period of time, we have lost 120,000 veterans to suicide. That tells a story. This doesn't come from someone who looks from the outside looking in at the anecdotal evidence. This comes from a personal testament of someone who has struggled himself and has used the natural plant to facilitate recovery, stability, and post-traumatic growth. I can tell you as a personal testament that It is actually proving to be an exit drug. And if you look at the states who have legalized, in the last year alone, opioid use has dropped over 20%. In some states, in excess of 30%. And I can tell you that veterans en masse are gravitating towards plants over pills to use this as a performance enhancer, to catalyze that post-traumatic growth and facilitate the integration back into a functional society. So as the veteran community, as a voice who represents the ground combat element, the intelligence community, and the special operations community has took the brunt of this over the last 20 years, give us access to a plan that provides the medical efficacy that we need to get back to the dinner table with our families. Thank you, and again, thank you, ma'am.
And then we have Dan Caldwell with Concerned Veterans of America, also a Marine Corps veteran.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for leading on this issue and so many other issues that are important to the veterans and military community. My name is Dan Caldwell. I'm the Senior Advisor for Concerned Veterans for America. And as the Congresswoman said, I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. I'm also a veteran of the Iraq War. I'm also honored to be joined by two of my colleagues, Roseanne and Stefan, who've also served overseas in the global war on terror. Concerned Veterans for America is supporting this legislation for one simple reason. Those who chose to put their lives on the line for this country should not have to choose between continuing a medical treatment that is working for them and federal employment opportunities and the benefits that they earned in the service of their country. That is wrong that many veterans have to make that choice, and the States Reform Act corrects those injustices. For years, as previous speakers have pointed out, we've been deploying Americans overseas in support of the global war on terror. For many, these deployments have taken a toll on mind and body. Imagine every day going outside the wire in 100 pounds worth of gear, engaging in direct combat on months on end. For even the toughest minds and bodies, that will take a toll. And for many veterans, medical cannabis has proven to be a better solution than the high doses of medication that the VA supplies, and often has very intense side effects that can inhibit a veteran's growth. And we believe in options, we believe in choice, and we believe that veterans should have informed choices around cannabis. That the VA should more importantly do research to determine whether or not these alternative treatments can be better than some of the current treatments which we've seen have led to addiction and ultimately haven't treated the fundamental illnesses that are driving some of the problems that we've seen coming out of this global war on terror. So we're honored to be here today. Again, Congresswoman, thank you for supporting this legislation. We look forward to working with you and the other original co-sponsors to get this across the finish line.
Next, we have Jillian Snyder, Policy Director of Criminal Justice and Communities, former NYPD. With you today. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. My name is Jillian Snyder. I'm the Policy Director of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at Art Street Institute. I was born and raised, still live in New York City, where I'm also a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Perhaps more notably, I'm a retired New York City police officer, where I served in various assignments such as anti-crime, vice operations, street-level narcotics enforcement, and patrol. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who dedicated her life to reducing crime and making our streets safer, that it is long past time to legalize cannabis both statewide and federally, the latter of which we are here to discuss today. It is no secret that cannabis use has increased in our country over the past few decades. 36 states have legalized or decriminalized the substance, either for recreational or medical use, and for good reason. Law enforcement should be focused on combating violent crime that threatens public safety, not using valuable time and resources carrying out duties that actually distract from the mission of law enforcement. As a career cop, I can tell you that police want to keep people safe. They really want to go after the bad guy and not arrest individuals for petty crimes. Living in a state that has now legalized cannabis, what has always been mind-boggling to me is the unwillingness of federal actors to catch up to what is clearly proven good, smart policy, bringing federal law in line with state law. For conservatives who widely claim an interest in fiscal responsibility and police credibility, the legislation introduced today supports both of these goals. We need to stop wasting between $600 million and $3 billion
billion taxpayer dollars every year on arresting low-level recreational marijuana users and undermining the rule of law by allowing such a stark difference in federal and state policies to continue to exist on the books. That is why it is vital that we are here today to stand with Congresswoman Mace and all of her colleagues who are supporting this effort, who have spoken out in the past in support of cannabis legalization, for proposing a comprehensive federal framework of decriminalization and bringing federal law into the modern age. Cops and citizens alike applaud you. Thank you very much.
Next is Rezwan Khan, who is the president of the Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce and DNA Genetics.
Hello, my name is Rezwan Khan and I'm the president of the Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce. I'm honored to be here today. This moment marks a very historic day in beginning to work with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to bring an end to the criminalization and prohibition of cannabis in this country. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Mace for her leadership and her commitment to furthering this issue. I stand here today as an advocate, an entrepreneur, a patient, and a patriot. I've made it a lifelong goal of mine to right the wrongs of cannabis prohibition for patients like myself, caregivers, home growers who rely on cannabis as medicine, for small farmers, small businesses, and everyday Americans just looking for a good job to make an honest buck. For those who have been negatively impacted by cannabis prohibition. And lastly, for the majority of Americans who believe that it's time that we make change. The States Reform Act is a competitive and diverse, it would create a competitive and diverse American cannabis industry. The bill ensures low barriers to entry as well as a competitive tax rate. The bill would create a national marketplace and finally open up access to traditional banking and financial services. The proposed legislation will create jobs, promote economic growth, and allow our country to take its rightful place as the leader in this global industry. And while the bill recognized that cannabis is an important agricultural crop with myriad of uses, it also recognizes the true medicinal value and benefit it provides to millions of Americans every day. The States Reform Act provides a realistic and common sense path forward for businesses and regulators to seamlessly transition from our current patchwork system to a truly free and open national market. This proposed legislation is comprehensive, deliberate, purposeful, and intentional in its drafting and its function. We at the Global Alliance are proud to endorse this bill, and we thank you again, Representative Mace, for your leadership on this issue and for really setting the stage for what is going to be the final push for legalization in this country. Thank you.
Executive Director of Global Alliance for Cannabis.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Meyer. I'm the Executive Director of Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce. I'm honored to be here today with many friends and colleagues as part of this historic event. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Representative Mace for her leadership and her vision on cannabis reform. It has been great to work with her and her outstanding team on this comprehensive and forward-looking proposal. I'd also like to thank the 5 co-sponsors that have joined onto the bill. I'd also would be remiss if I didn't mention one of my colleagues today who couldn't be here, Weldon Angelos, without whom many Republicans would not be engaging in the issue of criminal justice reform, and many Republican organizations and right-wing organizations would not be as well. The States Reform Act is a truly visionary act that provides a competitive marketplace while ensuring public safety. Representative Mace's leadership is an important and historic step in building a bipartisan bridge with her Senate and House colleagues and broadening the congressional consensus around ending federal marijuana criminalization and prohibition. The SRA ensures low barriers to entry, especially for small and socially and economically disadvantaged businesses, and it provides a competitive tax rate so that everyone can compete in a fair American marketplace. The SRA provides a clear framework and guideposts for pivoting from federal prohibition to state permission. The necessary clarity and firm timelines for both businesses and regulators to end federal prohibition and adjust to the new marketplace are within the bill. It follows a long-standing bipartisan consensus that federal criminal prohibition should be over and that those who are nonviolent, non-cartel cannabis offenders should be given a second chance to participate in society. In conclusion, our organization, Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce, happily endorses this bill. And thank you again for your leadership.
Next, we have Jeffrey Lawrence, the Managing Director of Drug Policy with Reason Foundation.
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you mentioned, I'm Jeffrey Lawrence, Director of Drug Policy at Reason Foundation and steering member for the Cannabis Freedom Alliance. For the better part of the past 85 years, the federal government has effectively enforced a prohibition against marijuana, and somehow marijuana still exists. When there is a demand, there will be a supply, but we have effectively pushed that supply into the underground market. The economics of black markets are such that when people cannot have a peaceful forum for adjudicating disputes or enforcing their property claims, they resort to violence. And we've seen that all across our southern border states, especially and that has increased over the past several decades. As states have experimented with regulated state markets for marijuana, we've seen that there has been an associated decline in violent crime across the southern states. This shows that legalization is working and that competitive, open, regulated markets are the best way to treat a controlled substance like cannabis. We are very proud to have worked on this bill with Representative Mace because it accomplishes a number of things. One, it enshrines the state markets that are currently in existence and allows for peaceable interstate commerce among those markets. And it gives a second chance to all of those who have been victims of the drug war over the past several decades. So on behalf of the Reason Foundation and the Cannabis Freedom Alliance, we'd like to thank you for your leadership, Representative, and we look forward to continuing to work.
Next, we have Eric Sterling, who's chair of the Montgomery County, Maryland Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse Advisory Council.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm no longer with the Montgomery County Alcohol Drug Abuse. That was
My bad.
I did that for 10 years. I was chair for 3 years. But I'm representing law enforcement action partnerships that I've been part of for many years. And on behalf of, so I am Eric Sterling. On behalf of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, we endorse your effort, Congresswoman, to end federal marijuana prohibition with the introduction of the States Reform Act. Recently, I served on the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission under Governors O'Malley and Hogan in creating Maryland's legal medical cannabis industry. But in the 1980s, I was the anti-drug counsel for the House Judiciary Committee when Ronald Reagan was president. In the 1980s, when I worked for the Congress, conflict between Democrats and Republicans was very intense, and the parties competed for the title of toughest on drugs. But that approach didn't work. Deaths from illegal drugs have risen from 6,100 in 1980 to almost 100,000 annually. None of those deaths are due to cannabis. The nation's law enforcement community recognizes that regulation and control of marijuana for medical use and for adult use makes sense. A Pew Research Center study found that 68% of the officers surveyed supported either the legalization of medical cannabis or adult and medical use. Today, law enforcement support for marijuana legalization is almost certainly much greater. The Law Enforcement Action Partnership has always understood that marijuana prohibition is unenforceable. We have watched as the American people, year after year, rejected the arguments for prohibition. We have learned that the public health rationales for marijuana prohibition were false. We have seen marijuana enforcement alienate many young adults and people of color from our system of law and justice. We lament that marijuana enforcement does not prevent crime or increase public safety. Marijuana enforcement now wastes the time of police officers, prosecutors and courts and wastes billions of dollars annually. Every day that marijuana remains illegal, almost 1,000 people are arrested on marijuana charges. If you believe the FBI, in 2020 that number was over 350,000. For most of those people, mostly poor people, disproportionately people of color, a marijuana arrest is an economic catastrophe, if not an economic death sentence. A marijuana arrest usually results in the loss of a job, homelessness, family breakup, and long-term unemployment. It's on the majority in the Congress, so many of whom regularly tweet about the legalization of marijuana, to send a bill to the White House. The introduction of the States Reform Act is more evidence that a bipartisan bill could have been passed months ago. Since the Democrats took over on January 20th, hundreds of thousands of lives have been thrown into chaos because of marijuana arrests. And every day of delay, nearly 1,000 families are hit with a marijuana prohibition disaster. This act, the States Reform Act, is a great step forward toward a just and workable system to reduce crime, money laundering, tax evasion, and corruption. This smart bill, with its well-considered taxation level and with expungement provisions, is going to make economic sense for American families and American workers. The Law Enforcement Action Partnership commends Representative Mace and her co-sponsors for their genuine leadership. Thank you.
Next we have Steve Hawkins from the U.S. Cannabis Council. I also want to recognize Jessica Billingsley, who's the board chair for the U.S. Cannabis Council. She's here today as well. Steve?
Hello, I'm Steve Hawkins. I'm CEO of the U.S. Cannabis Council. We represent 65 of some of the largest companies in the United States working on cannabis. We also represent over 320,000 individuals currently working in the cannabis industry. Representative Mace, we thank you for bringing forward the States Reform Act, because we recognize that there is extraordinary opportunity in this bill, that millions of Americans can benefit, not only from the relief from medical cannabis, but also for the jobs that still will be created, for the billions of tax and revenue dollars that can be generated. I have dedicated my life, over 30 years, to civil rights, to criminal justice reform. And I know that this bill goes far in the right direction. It recognizes the need for expungement. It releases those who are being kept in federal custody because of their cannabis convictions. And it opens the door again for tremendous opportunity for all. I think this bill does the right thing in terms of treating cannabis like alcohol and putting it in the appropriate federal jurisdiction. It provides the relief that our veterans need, and it opens up opportunities, I think, for the kind of bipartisan cooperation that we need to get cannabis over the finish line. So Representative Mace, again, thank you very much for your leadership, and the U.S. Cannabis Council stands with you on this bill.
We have one final speaker that I will introduce. Her name is Jill Swing with the South Carolina Compassionate Care. And before I do that, I've worked with Jill on cannabis reform in South Carolina. I said earlier we have CBD. We do not yet have medical cannabis, something that I supported as a state lawmaker. One of the reasons that I say this bill, whether you're Republican or Democrat, it's not going to force cannabis on South Carolina if South Carolina does not want it. I'm hopeful in Jill's work that they will get medical cannabis in South Carolina soon. I endorse it and support it. If you're someone who wants cannabis reform and made it legalized, if your state has legalized it, this bill allows you to operate within those parameters. This provides a framework for every state and what they're doing today and have been doing for 25 plus years in this space. So with that, before I take questions, Jill Swing with South Carolina Compassionate Care. You can come on up. Thank you so much for being here from my district and a constituent, South Carolina's 1st Congressional District.
Yes, thank you, Representative Mace. I'm honored to be here today with my representative, Nancy Mace, all the way from South Carolina, so she's here. Yeah, I am the president and founder of South Carolina Compassionate Care Alliance, which is a patient advocacy and education legalization since 2014 when we first passed the CBD bill to benefit my daughter who has severe intractable epilepsy. So to put that in perspective, at the time she was 6 years old. In 2 days she's going to turn 14. So I've been fighting for medical cannabis legalization in South Carolina for half of my daughter's life. And I'm thrilled that finally in January we've been assured that the Compassionate Care Act, which is our comprehensive medical cannabis bill, is going to be debated on the Senate floor when they go back into session in January. However, this is a battle that has to be fought not only on the state level but also on the federal level. And so that's why I'm here today to support Representative Mace's bill. When I think about cannabis law on the federal level, I think about all of the patients who've had to leave their home states and seek medical treatment using cannabis in states where they have legal access. And those treatments are often life-altering, if not life-saving. However, they become then refugees in their new states because it is federally illegal for them to transport their medication across state lines. So therefore, they're not able to come home for the holidays. Their children aren't able to go to Disney World. You know, many milestones are missed, and the State Reform Act actually addresses that issue. So I just want to applaud Congresswoman Mace and clearly all of her effort and research that has gone into this bill and exploring all the complexities that are created between the conflict between states and federal law. And so I'm happy to say on behalf of the South Carolina Compassionate Care Alliance and all of the patients in South Carolina who will ultimately benefit in having legal access to cannabis at both state and federal level, that we will endorse your bill, and we appreciate all of your hard work and leadership that you've taken on the bill. Thank you. Thank you. And then lastly, the board doesn't address it, but interstate commerce is addressed in the bill, imports and exports are addressed in the bill. I also took special care to put certain medical provisions and protections in there. Obviously, whatever states have legalized medically are in there, but I took special care to also recognize patients with HIV and AIDS, arthritis, cancer, chronic pain from sickle cell, and also PTSD. So I put a lot of thought into how we can make this kind of legislation palatable for people on both sides of the aisle across every state in the country.